Planet Earth. Nothing has had such a remarkable impact on our planet during the last millennia as this object, made of 80% water, 10% fat, and 8% protein, the human brain. Obviously, the brain has accomplished amazing things. How can human thinking and consciousness be explained? Can they be reduced to purely material processes? Or are human beings more than just their brains? When riding a bike, thousands of sensors register the smallest accelerations and changes in pressure. The nerves transmit these signals towards the brain within a split second. After processing these signals, the brain initiates the reaction of millions of muscle fibers through neuronal pulses. This way, a biker can keep his balance, even in difficult situations. Brain and body together accomplish extraordinary abilities. Scientists want to understand the mystery of the brain. The brain contains about 100 billion nerve cells. Every neuron is connected with up to 10,000 other neurons. That makes more than 100 trillion connections. Lined up in a row as a chain, that would be 800,000 kilometers, a distance to the moon and back. The electric pulses in the neuron fibers are transmitted at a speed of up to 450 kilometers per hour. The operating frequency of the brain is only within the kilohertz range. This is remarkably slow compared to the recent giga and terahertz computers. While the brain only amounts to about 2% of body weight, it consumes about 20% of our total energy. That's enough power to illuminate a 20-watt light bulb. A masterful achievement of the brain is its ability to evaluate signals from the environment and to react accordingly. The eye records several million optical stimuli every second by the receptors on the retina. Converted into electrical signals, they're transmitted via the visual nerve into the brain. Here they're processed and finally perceived as an integrated image. The ear, however, receives sound waves. The acoustic vibrations are converted into electrical pulses through tiny hairs. The acoustic nerve transmits these signals to the brain for processing so we can perceive sounds or noises. Both sight and hearing start with electrical signals, which, after processing, result in very different forms of perception. These sense perceptions of sounds and images can be connected to meanings. They become symbols which make sense to us. This is the basis for all communication. Neurolinguist Petra Schumacher investigates the processing of language within the brain.
There are countless languages in the world, and they're all processed and represented through our individual brain. So the question arises, what is the connection between the diversity of languages and the brain?
During an eye tracker experiment, the movement of the pupil is tracked while a test person is looking at a text or an image. In which way do they connect concepts they hear with objects or people that appear simultaneously on a screen? Studies show that human beings already have expectations about the structure of pictures and texts. If an expectation is not fulfilled, the focus of the gaze is delayed. New sense perceptions are continually compared with existing experiences. This establishes an important foundation for the understanding of meaning.
What is meaning? This is a very interesting question because meaning at the level of a word is connected with our having a notion of a table or a chair, or with something like war and peace. We have abstract concepts and we believe that they are stored somewhere in the brain and can be recalled. But meaning can also arise within a sentence or communication.
Ein Beispiel wäre hier, wenn wir eine Situation anschauen.
An example would be a situation in a restaurant. Imagine there are many guests sitting at the tables. One waiter says to another, "The cappuccino wants to pay." If we hear this phrase without context, we might say, "Impossible. A cappuccino can't pay." Paying is an action which must be performed by a person who can and wants to pay. Cappuccino is just a substance. What does the speaker mean when he says, "The cappuccino wants to pay"? He means that the person who ordered the cappuccino wants to pay. We often use such shortcuts in our communication.
With only a few rules, human language can comprehend innumerable concepts. This distinguishes human communication from that of animals.
In my view, the distinction between human beings and animals is language. I don't think that animals have a language in the sense we credit humans with. Animals have limited abilities to communicate.
Humans can recognize symbols, combine them creatively, and even use them to develop new meanings. But how do humans learn a language? In order for any sound to be given a meaning, another person is needed, another human being speaking the same language.
It is an interesting observation that we need contact with other humans to acquire language. We need another person giving us input in order to understand the rules of a language, to know how my language, German, English, or Chinese, works, and of course, to comprehend words for certain concepts.
The human brain exhibits innate fundamental skills, which must be developed by practice. Philosopher and psychiatrist Thomas Fuchs explains that this is not only true for language learning.
Hearing and seeing arise from interaction, which must be practiced and continually repeated, and the brain adapts during this process.
Human abilities are developed in the complex interaction between genetic inheritance and the environment.
Of course, the brain has inherited potential, but this potential is mostly used, actualized, and realized through the human social environment. Without this potential, a little child cannot learn anything about his or her social environment. Without social interaction, he can't really get to know himself. Our self-consciousness, which we presuppose as self-evident, is a result of social interactions in which I have perceived myself as being perceived and spoken to by others. All this develops a little infant's brain in a crucial way, and without this, essential features of the brain are not developed.
The human brain accomplishes amazing abilities. But how do we arrive at such knowledge? Today, researchers use high-tech medical equipment. The EEG, the electroencephalogram, records changes in the electrical activity close to the cranial surface, almost in real time. Magnetic resonance imaging provides a spatially resolved view of the whole brain by measuring the response of atomic nuclei to changing magnetic fields. The respective measurements allow conclusions about brain activity to be made. Before these non-invasive tests were invented, scientists relied on the examination of injured people.
Sehr viel hat man gelernt aus Erkrankungen.
Much was learned from studying diseases and injuries, especially during the wars.
Die Hirnforschung, das klingt jetzt
Even though it may sound grim, brain science made a lot of progress during the First World War because there were many people with cranial injuries.
nur eine Kopfverletzung hatte.
Neurosurgeon Volker Sturm has performed many operations on the brain.
Basierend auf computertomografischen Voruntersuchungen.
Based on preliminary investigations using computer tomography, we can simulate every operation and implant electrodes into the relevant areas with the highest precision.
Die werden dann unter der Haut.
Under the skin, these electrodes are then connected with a pulse generator, very similar to a pacemaker for the heart, which is implanted at the same position. For example, on the chest muscle under the skin. The goal is to restore the malfunctioning processes back to
Zur
normal.
Normalität zurückzuführen.
The surgeon explains the successful operation on a patient suffering from Parkinson's disease.
Also so war das.
This is how he was before the surgery. The patient trembled enormously. Here he is trying to take a glass of water.
Zu nehmen, zu trinken.
3 months after the brain surgery, the patient is able to control his actions through deep stimulation.
Simulation läuft.
The stimulation is on. He doesn't even realize it. And you can see that he can move his right hand in a completely normal way. That is the check. He can even pour the water into another glass. And now the stimulator is switched off.
To such impressive successes prove that humans have unlocked the way the brain works.
Wir wissen noch ganz wenig. Aber wir wissen
We know very, very little.
ausreichend
But
viel,
in spite of this level of knowledge, we have enough information to intervene effectively in the case of specific illnesses.
bestimmten Erkrankungen schon sehr effizient eingreifen zu können.
Brain structure obviously has an impact on the capabilities of a human being, but can measuring the brain help us to make statements about the personality of a human being? Theologian Christina Austerau has investigated this issue.
I find it extremely exciting and challenging to discover and understand the impact of damage to the brain, such as Phineas Gage, the railway worker who was made famous on account of his injury. An explosion caused an iron rod to be speared through his brain, but he survived as if by a miracle. He recovered, but his character seemed completely changed. Having been a reliable, honorable worker, a faithful husband, and a caring father, he turned into a difficult man who cursed, lied, and didn't turn up for work. His character was completely changed, and apparently that was connected with his brain injury.
Yet neuroscientists dispute to what extent and how sustainable the personality of Phineas Gage really changed, and whether social and other factors were responsible for this. A change in brain structure can indeed result in a change of functionality. However, certain functions cannot be attributed to specific areas in a one-to-one manner. The brain can adjust its structure to a certain degree and is therefore able to learn.
Man kann sich diese Lernfähigkeit
This ability to learn is called the brain's plasticity, which occurs in our interactions, our actions in the environment.
Tätigkeiten in der Umwelt erfährt. Man kann sich das vielleicht veranschaulichen.
We can illustrate that with a simple example, such as learning to type with a typewriter or a computer keyboard.
Computertastaturschreibens darstellt. Wir tun das,
We do it by placing our fingers on the keyboard and then, step by step, associating the letter keys with the respective fingers.
mit den jeweiligen passenden Fingern in Verbindung bringen. Was passiert dabei im Gehirn?
What happens in the brain?
Verknüpfungen.
The brain now develops connections between the motor function of the specific fingers and the meaning that is attributed to this movement, namely pressing the key of a specific letter.
Zu tasten. Das Gehirn passt sich hier
The brain adjusts itself as well as possible to this interaction. In the end, we are able to type. This means we do not have to recall these associations consciously, but our fingers have acquired this knowledge,
bewusst klar zu machen, sondern die Finger haben nun dieses Wissen erworben
I am able to type the word habit without having to recall that the letter H is associated with this finger and A to that finger. Hence, a new ability has arisen, which translates the word habit directly into the movement of my fingers.
Unmittelbar in die Motorik umsetzt, die meine Finger dann ausüben.
The brain is flexible. Its structure can adapt. Neuronal roots that are frequently used are reinforced, while others degenerate. Experiences leave their traces in the brain. It can be trained, or, due to lack of exercise, corrode in a figurative sense. But what happens if the brain never developed completely, or if a part of the brain had to be removed by surgery, for example, due to a tumor? Numerable examples demonstrate that the brain is capable to compensate for these deficiencies remarkably well. Many people with such brains are not visibly different. For example, one girl had to have half her brain removed due to chronic inflammation. Yet this girl was still able to learn 2 foreign languages. And what about children who are born without a cerebrum? Can they exhibit human characteristics at all?
For a long time, people believed that these children could not be conscious or experience anything at all. But it turned out that even those children with a missing cerebrum were able to interact affectionately on an elementary level. For example, this little girl makes small elementary movements which can be interpreted as smiling when her brother is laid on her lap. So she seems to experience joy, and she even performs simple movements in order to encourage this experience to be repeated.
Another astonishing example. When you see the reduced brain of this 44-year-old Frenchman, you would never expect that he has an average IQ. He works for the government. Development and functionality of the brain are obviously more complex than simple models suggest. A similar assessment is given by the Nobel Prize winner for medicine, Thomas Südhoff.
Ich möchte mal prinzipiell dazu sagen, dass wir die Komplexität oder den Aufbau.
Generally speaking, we are beginning, very slowly, to understand the complexity and structure of the brain, but only in rough terms.
Es ist einfach nicht so, dass man sagen
It simply cannot be said that one part of the brain does this or that. We simply don't know that. We do know how sensory information enters the brain, but we don't know at all how this information is processed.
wissen wir überhaupt nicht.
To explore such questions, neuroscientists study simpler organisms.
Also eines der Modelltiere.
One of the archetypal animals used in neuroscience to better understand the brain is Neuroscientists elegans, a very tiny worm. We know exactly where every cell is located in the organism, how many cells there are, and how they develop, how many neurons there are, how they are connected, and how the synapses form.
Und wie die Nervenzellen verschaltet sind, wie die miteinander Synapsen formieren. Man weiß seit mehr
For more than 20 years, it has been known that there are 302 neurons, and because of the microscopic anatomical reconstruction of the whole organism, we know how they communicate. But from this, we can't deduce how the nervous system really works.
Das kann man daraus noch lange nicht ableiten. Man weiß nur, wo sie miteinander kommunizieren. Man weiß
We only know where the nerve cells are communicating, but not what this communication looks like, how the synapses transmit stimuli and information, and how they process information, and what each single neuron is doing.
Aber selbst bei 300 Nervenzellen ist es bis jetzt nicht möglich, ein Gesamtbild zu haben.
Human beings do not just have 302, but about 10 to the power of 13 nerve cells, billions, billions, billions. And for about 99.9% of these, we don't know how they are interconnected. So before we arrive at a deeper understanding, we will have to wait just a few more years.
Müssen wir noch ein paar Jahre warten.
So, do neuroscientists simply have to gather more data to understand the mental capabilities of human beings? Is the origin of consciousness only a question of the number and interconnection of neurons? To what extent is neuroscience able to measure the complete state of the human brain? Neuroscientist John Dylan Haynes recognizes limitations.
Das menschliche Gehirn mit seinen 86 Milliarden Nervenzellen.
It is totally unclear what it would mean to measure the complete state of the human brain with its 86 billion neurons. One could not even stop with one measurement for each nerve cell. You would also have to measure each synapse and every membrane segment. So it is not entirely clear what it would mean to measure the complete state of the brain and what would be sufficient for a prediction.
Nobel Prize winner Thomas Südhoff warns us to be very cautious about assuming complete models from such measurements.
As scientists, we must have a very clear view of where we stand and what the challenges are. Of course, we must try to understand things better. But we cannot simply go there and say, that is the way it is. Somehow this will work. And then we will do this and try that. It is a simple fact, in my opinion, that we must say, we just don't know.
How far can the analytical power of science go in these questions? Philosopher Brigitte Falkenberg explains.
The natural sciences help to make our everyday knowledge more precise and understandable. We philosophers would like to understand how we can intervene in this world and where the limits are. How our consciousness is able to make decisions that then turn that into reality. The way we experience ourselves and brain research has not been able to explain this.
Behavioral neurobiologist Boris Kochubay thinks there's a principal limit of the neurosciences here.
You can't describe the whole world with physics alone. And in the same way, you can't describe the whole world with neurophysiology alone.
To illustrate his point, he uses a banknote.
You can try to explain money in a purely scientific way. For example, there are materials like paper, metals, etc. This scientific analysis can be done, and it is not at all irrelevant, but it will never explain how money works. Finance is an academic discipline in its own right, and it can't be reduced to the material science of money.
So a principal problem is that neuroscientists can only measure the activity of the brain, but not the content of our thoughts. What a test person is thinking or feeling can only be communicated by that person. Philosopher J.P. Moreland explains this so-called first-person perspective.
When a neuroscientist is going to try to do research on the brain and wants to know what's happening in a person's conscious life while the brain is undergoing certain activity, they have to stop and ask the person, what's going on? Now, why do they have to ask the person? Because the person alone has access to his own consciousness. All the neuroscientist has access to are the brain states, and so the neuroscientist cannot know what's going on in the consciousness because that is not discerned through scientific method or instrumentation. That is known from my first person, introspective awareness of the happenings going on inside of me, and other people don't have access to that.
Scientists don't usually observe their own brain, but that of a test person. What somebody feels or experiences is the first-person perspective. It's like one of those trick pictures where I first see one thing, but then I look again and I see another thing. I never see both at the same time. I believe we will never find an equation which tells us that the neurons are doing this or that, and that causes... Here we already hesitate because we have no language to connect the two to each other.
There are reasons to doubt whether a certain state of the brain can be equated with a certain thought or feeling. Neuroscience is always looking at human beings from the outside, but what someone experiences on the inside is only known by the person himself.
Of course, we can observe biological correlates for concepts like freedom, faith, love, or laughing. We can ask, what happens in the brain when we exercise freedom, have faith, love, or laughter? But what the phenomena themselves are, what they mean, what they feel like, this can't be seen in a neuronal network.
However, it's precisely this inward experience that's central to being a human being. For example, couples in love are on cloud nine. Neuroscientists could measure the hormone levels and the neuronal currents, but they can't say anything about the feeling of being in love. Falling in love seems to be more than just a biochemical process. If human consciousness were only a product of neuron activity, should we then not be able to reconstruct it by building suitable circuits?
Does the brain work like a computer, or do some computers come close to working like a brain? Of course, the question is whether a computer built by humans could really create consciousness. Eager supporters of artificial intelligence will say, of course, this is only a matter of time. We will one day succeed. As a philosopher, I am rather skeptical about this, because we know that the brain is the most complex entity in the universe. That's what the neuroscientists say. And the brain can't be detached from the human organism. We are not brains in a vat, to cite a favorite example from philosophy. Our brain is part of a living organism, and it is by far more complex than an artificially produced computer.
Would it be possible to breed a neuron cell culture in a test tube, which then develops introspective awareness like the human brain? Can we imagine a computer developing self-awareness and saying, "I am"? What is the difference between human thinking and the calculations of a computer?
The computer's not rational. It doesn't literally go through thought processes. It simply is programmed so that it can imitate consciousness. Now think about what it's like for you to deliberate about what you're going to do this afternoon. You're thinking, am I going to go for lunch for Mexican food, or should I go back to the office and finish some work I have to do? And you weigh these different things, and eventually you make a decision. Every stage you are aware of what you're thinking about. Computers can go through imitating calculations, but they have no sense of, oh, well, that's a 2, and this is the add sign. They're constructed to imitate consciousness. They do not actually engage in it.
A computer can only simulate external behavior and produce certain calculated results. But this is not enough to ascribe consciousness to a computer.
The simple fact that an artificial system, like a computer, performs certain input-output connections is certainly not sufficient to say this process is anything like meaningfulness, consciousness, or experience.
This is illustrated by the so-called Chinese room thought experiment. Here, a person writes down questions in Chinese letters and passes them through a small slit into a closed room. The person in that room doesn't have a clue about Chinese letters, but is using a sign translation table. He manages to compose a correct answer. The correct answer does not prove, however, that the person understands Chinese. It only shows that he could connect the symbols in the right manner. In the same way, a computer does not understand a language or its meaning, even if it might translate a text correctly due to good programming.
The human ability to use language creatively and draw conclusions as a listener or reader, or to understand the intention of an author. I mean, these characteristics of human beings are going to be very hard to simulate as real human conversation using language recognition programs or other computer algorithms.
menschliche Kommunikation zu simulieren.
While human beings can understand meaning and experience feelings, a computer only produces corresponding output for a given input. In spite of certain similarities, human beings, including their brains, seem to be fundamentally different to computers.
Das Gehirn ist sehr langsam.
The brain is very slow. Only now, after the development of computer technology, have we understood just how slowly the brain functions. But in spite of these disadvantages, this device enables incredible adaptation to the world of our fellow humans. We have an incredibly fine ability to understand others and to view others as human beings.
A computer lacks self-consciousness. It can't be called a person, and personal relationships are not possible. But what then is this I of a human being? Can this I be localized in the brain? Theologian Ulrich Eibach explains his view.
Das Ich sehen wir nicht im Gehirn.
The I, or the self, can't be seen in the brain. The I is not an entity that can be identified in specific areas of the brain.
Gefühlslose, noch nicht mal Schmerzempfinden.
My brain is an unfeeling organ, not even able to sense pain, and I, as I sit here, am not my brain, but I am Ulrich Eibach, a unity of body and soul, and I don't say my brain is thinking, but I am thinking.
Sage ich nicht, mein Gehirn denkt, sondern ich denke.
Wenn wir versuchen,
It is impossible to try to explain the complex behavior of certain heroes in literature or important persons in history, such as Jesus, Goethe, or Buddha, on the basis of epiphenomenalism. That means without taking into account their consciousness, treating them like pure machines. That's not possible. No way. You could express it like this. To explain consciousness is very difficult, but to explain human beings without consciousness is even more difficult.
Des Menschen ohne Bewusstsein ist noch viel schwieriger.
Consciousness exists, although there is no explanation for it. We have no access, and I am absolutely sure that we will never be able to explain it. This is one of the very great mysteries.
The I or self is closely connected to consciousness. That is, with the awareness which we have when we concentrate on our own subjective experience. The qualities we experience subjectively are called qualia.
In human experience, we find subjective qualities of experience, the so-called qualia. Among them are the colors which we see, red, green, blue, and the sounds which we hear, aromas we smell, and so on. But if you look into the brain, then you look at the 86 billion nerve cells of the average brain, but nowhere will you see colors, sounds, or smells. The neurons are all very similar. It's hard to distinguish them from one another. So we've reached the limit of our understanding. The question is, how can we principally explain these so-called qualia based on the activity of the brain?
How can we connect the cause and effect relationships in the body and neuronal network with subjective experience? How does the brain bring it about that I experience something and I have a feeling about something?
Another thought experiment helps to illustrate the point.
Let's assume we live in the year 10,000 AD, where we now have learned everything there is to know about matter. Human beings actually now have a God's eye, omniscient knowledge of everything there is to know about matter. Just assume that for the sake of argument. But now suppose that there is the world's leading neuroscientist named Mary, who can describe in complete detail the physics and chemistry and neuroscience of seeing something. So she can describe the wavelengths that bounce off, how it goes in and hits the rods and cones in the eyes and all that. She knows all the physical facts about what it's like to see. There are no physical facts she doesn't know, but she was born blind. All of a sudden, one day, she walks into the laboratory, and miracle of miracles, she suddenly, for the first time, gains the ability to see. She would now gain knowledge of a whole new world of facts. There would be facts like what it's like to see red, what it's like to see yellow, what it's like to see all kinds of things. Now, if she already knew all the physical facts before this miracle happened, and she learned brand new facts, those facts can't be physical facts. They have to be mental facts. And they are mental facts about qualia, what it is like to see red or see yellow. You cannot describe what it is like to be in pain through any material language. If you use the language of physics and chemistry or neuroscience, you may describe what causes the pain in physical language, but the pain itself is not capable of being described in any physical language because the language of physics and chemistry and biology and neuroscience do not contain the concept of what it is like to experience such and such. Qualia can only be described from the first-person perspective of the person having the experience.
The first-person perspective and the scientific observer's perspective are two complementary ways to understand human beings. Both make statements that complement each other.
What does it mean to say we are, we exist? From which perspective can we say that? When we take the view of the neuroscientist analyzing everything using microscopes and computers, etc., then we see the way the body functions. When I talk to you, then I don't see you just as a body, but as a person, as a you. And when I try to listen to myself, what I think and feel, this is again another perspective that can't be reduced to the perspective of how the body works.
The qualia problem is closely connected to the problem of free will. For example, a racing car driver must perform complex maneuvers within a very short time. On the one hand, he makes conscious decisions. On the other hand, his reactions occur nearly automatically. To what extent does the racing car driver make a free decision? To what extent is he determined by the circumstances? For a long time, human beings were persuaded that they could decide and act freely and with responsibility. Experiments in the 1970s put this into question. They suggested that human beings are determined by processes in the brain and have no free will. But neuroscientists have been re-examining the question of free will using different experiments.
Wenn das Gehirn einmal ein Anzeichen dafür zeigt, dass es sich entschieden hat.
If the brain indicates that a decision has been made, can one still cause human beings to revise their decision? Imagine a row of dominoes. When you push the first domino, usually the whole series falls down until the last domino has fallen.
Fällt die ganze Reihe bis der letzte Stein auch umgefallen.
It could be similar with decisions you make. As soon as brain activity is seen, indicating that the brain has made a decision, this would correspond to the first domino that was pushed. And then there follows a cascade of events, which occurs completely in sequence, until the last decision arriving at the last domino. That's when you finally act.
Und dann setzen sie die Handlung um. Die große Frage ist, ob diese
The big question is whether these signals of decision really behave in this sequential way, or whether the person has the possibility to intervene in the process. This could be compared to removing a domino halfway along the sequence, interrupting the series at that point.
die Reihe dann einfach abbricht. Wir haben dann Experimente gemacht.
We carried out experiments which tried to detect in real time the emergence of the decision signals in brain activity. and then test whether the test persons could interrupt and change their decision. The result was very surprising. Human beings can indeed revise a decision up until a very, very late moment, just before they start to move.
Kurz bevor sie anfangen, sich zu bewegen.
Other experiments suggest that changing a decision can happen at any point in time. So are human beings free to make decisions? What is this so-called free will? Philosophers give differing definitions.
Free will is the active power to choose to do something or to refrain from doing it without anything determining which way I act. The choice is up to me. I am a first mover. Nothing can cause me to cause my actions, or that would be an action that was determined by what was causing me to do it. It wouldn't be a free act that I did.
In scientific experiments, we can only observe and examine decisions in well-controlled situations. Human free will, however, manifests itself primarily in situations without a controlled setting.
In which setting do neuroscientists examine freedom? Is it about pressing a button? Is it about planning my life? Or about whom I want to marry? Or whether I drink coffee or tea in the morning? Or is it about whether I press this particular button now or not, obeying the instructions of the instructor in an experiment? So, how do I define freedom? What does it have to do with me as a person? And what is this tiny increase in brain activity just before I become aware that I want to press this button?
If human beings could not make free choices, how could they be responsible for their actions? They would only be following the impulses of their neurons. Couldn't we then predict future behavior of human beings based on their brain structure? Criminals could be convicted by scanning their brain before they committed the crime. It's an ambivalent issue for the legal profession. When can a criminal be held responsible for his actions? How should a judge decide?
The basic decision to show empathy or not can be made and must be made. Our freedom lies in this capability.
Ich wäre ein ganz schlechter Richter, weil ich
I would be a very bad judge because I would ask myself, with regard to every patient, whether he made the decision himself or that it was the inevitable outcome of his genetic and brain structure and of the circumstances under which he had to live.
genetischen Struktur, seiner Hirnstruktur und der Umstände, unter denen
Is he really responsible? In my opinion, in many cases, you really can't say.
Ich glaube, dass man das in vielen Fällen wirklich nicht sagen kann.
Human consciousness and free will suggest that human beings cannot be reduced to the material processes in their body. Is the human self more than merely the material brain?
I am not a divisible thing, and I can't exist in a percentage. That is to say, there can't be 85% of me here, or 35%. I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. I can't be divided into parts and one part thrown away and there's 80% of me here. I'm a whole that is either here or I'm not here. But every material object, including the brain, is divisible and can exist as a percentage. Indeed, the brain is obviously divisible, and in certain operations, they've taken out 55% of a person's brain. And after surgery, it's clear that the same person is there. But if they were their brain, then there would only be 45% of a person there. But everyone knows that's not true. You still have a unified conscious being that has lost some functioning, but they're still there even though the brain is divisible.
But if the I or self is distinct from its brain, could there be consciousness without a physical body? Patients who are in a coma have repeatedly reported so-called near-death experiences. They say that they went through a tunnel or observed their own body from the outside, even though their brain activity could no longer be measured. Philosopher Gary Habermas has examined hundreds of such cases.
We know that this tunnel thing is a fairly interesting experience of many, many people over the centuries. So a tunnel, a light, moving toward a light, experiencing what they are convinced are disembodied people around them, an angel, their grandmother, their father, their spouse, a child who was deceased. They experience being with somebody or an angel. And then those who get to the light will say, even atheists will say, wow, the light was so intense, way brighter than the sun, and yet I could keep my eyes open, and I felt this incredible kind of love.
Could these near-death experiences be regarded as psychopathological exceptions?
There are too many of these for them to all be mistaken. And what you find is that they have certain features in common cross-culturally.
How can these phenomena be explained? Could a lack of oxygen be responsible for these experiences? Materialistic explanations encounter a problem at this point. Some patients who emerge from comas recount having perceived things which they could not have seen had they not had brain activity and were located in the operating room.
One case of evidence for a near-death experience was a case of a woman. She reported, looking down at her body and then going further away and finding herself up above the hospital. And she's looking out at the horizon and she's saying, wow, that's a beautiful horizon. And then she looks down and there's this red tennis shoe on top of the hospital. So she reported seeing a red tennis shoe on the roof, and that got some interest. The medical doctor didn't believe it, but decided to check on a whim, found the shoe, and that's, to me, a decently evidential case of something seen at a distance from the person doing the reporting, as opposed to something that's reported in the emergency room.
Such experiences are not isolated. However, they're hard to check scientifically and hence a matter of controversial debate.
Sie können erstmal nur das erforschen, wo Sie
First of all, you can only examine what you can arrange in systematic research processes, unless you want to rely on pure chance. To have a person in the MRI, the magnetic resonance imaging, just at the moment they are having a near-death experience is very improbable. That means our understanding of such processes can in fact only begin if we really have measured the brain processes during such an experience. Everything else is nothing more than an indirect conclusion about what might have happened, but it's not hard evidence.
Apparently, science again reaches its limits at this point. But which role do worldview presuppositions play in the evaluation of these phenomena?
Die Nahtoderlebnisse sind eine Herausforderung an unser materialistisches.
Near-death experiences challenge our materialistic understanding of the world because they suggest a spiritual dimension to life, which can function without material basis.
Ohne materielle Basis funktionieren kann. Die Frage ist also,
the question, therefore, is whether the world is dualistic, that it is divided into two realms, a spiritual dimension and a material dimension.
Human beings in all generations have seen their own existence in a greater context which went beyond the purely material world. The questions about the origin and destination of life, identity, dignity, self-worth, God, and eternity had a large impact on the cultural history of mankind. Are these questions about God and transcendence only another product of our brain? Neuroscientists have made interesting observations.
You can stimulate that region of the brain and cause experiences of God that are illusory. They're solely the result of the stimulation of that brain site. But it doesn't follow from that there aren't real experiences of God where the experience of God stimulates the brain site, not the other way around.
Is the existence of God refuted if neuroscientists can bring about transcendent experiences under suitable conditions? As a comparison, would the existence of a real pizza be refuted by the fact that we could simulate a pizza taste experience using suitable magnetic fields? The simulation of a specific experience cannot refute the actual existence of the object which can be experienced by the brain.
Brain science can establish places in the brain that are activated when I meditate or pray. That's interesting, I suppose, but that doesn't really show anything about what meditation is. It doesn't show that there's no God of any kind.
Neuroscience cannot provide an answer to questions about the meaning of life or the existence of God. It could only measure activities in the brain which go along with such experiences. Does that mean that there's no way to find traces of God at all?
If there is a God, he must, as God, have left traces in this world. But traces are not simply self-evident. Traces are a matter of interpretation. If I believe and am persuaded that God has helped me, that he intervened, the very same event that can be explained completely different from an observer's perspective, which is not connected to this second-person perspective.
Scientific data and personal experiences can be interpreted differently according to the underlying worldview. If someone sees evidence for God's creative action in this world, he can understand human beings in a different context. In this view, human beings are not lost in the cosmos.
I am spoken to by God. I am the you of God, his counterpart. I do not know this by myself. It is being said to me through biblical texts, through my traditions. I am God's you. And from here, I'm also told what my purpose is and how this fits into this greater, all-encompassing reality.
Science cannot decide whether humans and this world are only made of matter, or whether there's an immaterial dimension to reality. What responsibility do scientists have to ensure that they are not influenced by their own worldview?
Ich glaube, dass wir als Wissenschaftler
I believe that we as scientists have an enormous responsibility to try to communicate that we as scientists have to know where our limits lie.
auch wissen, wo unsere Grenzen sind.
Neuroscience provides fascinating insights into the human brain. The function of the brain is closely connected to the capabilities of human beings. But can the essence of human beings be explained on the basis of material processes in the brain alone? Several experiences seem to elude such an explanation. Human beings are aware of themselves as conscious entities, and I, or the self, can experience colors, sounds, and pain. They recognize meaning, view themselves as authors of their intentions, and make their own decisions. Does it measure up to human identity to reduce these phenomena merely to the brain? Which worldview provides the best explanation for human beings with their fascinating brains and minds? The journey to the self suggests, I am more than my brain.